So what's driving our Promethean moment? What's unique about ours from the previous ones is that it isn't driven by a single technology like a printing press. It's actually driven by two what I call super cycles.
In 2005, he wrote a book, The World is Flat. He could see the level of change that was coming. He's written several books after that, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. He's written The Lexus and the Olive Tree prior to that. All of his work has been looking at this interconnection between science, technology, humans, and nature. I'm going to call on stage Thomas Friedman. As I said, 3-time Pulitzer winner, New York Times columnist, best-selling author. But before I call him on stage, we just want to show you a little canvas of the world that we are trying to engage with. So I'll ask the console to play that. Thank you so much for being here, Tom.
Pleasure.
We stole some of your phrases for the film.
Well, that's great. Yes. Made me nervous, though, watching all that.
It reminded you about what you've been diagnosing
Exactly.
for 40 decades. So, in fact, Tom has used this phrase about that we're opening Pandora's boxes because we've learned to part the Red Sea without absorbing the 10 Commandments. So, in fact, that's where I'd like to start, Tom. You were the original, you were called the sort of evangelist for globalization and for technology. You were full of optimism and euphoria in 2005 when you wrote The World is Flat. Today, you've become a tech cautionary, I would say. And you've been talking about these Pandora's boxes that we are unleashing. So can you talk to us about why your mind has shifted? And what are these data points that you're picking up that make you feel that we are on simultaneous and dangerous tipping points?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Shoma. And I'm having fond memories of Goa and our last conversation like this. I would simply say that when I wrote The World is Flat, which I wrote from Bangalore, basically is where the
Tom,
book
will you
was,
just speak closer?
where the book was conceived. It was really the beginning of this era of globalization. And there was a lot about it which I found extremely exciting. More people were growing out of poverty faster than any time in the history of the world. And when I see 400, 500 million people growing out of poverty faster than any time in the history of the world, that kind of makes my heart go pitter-patter a little bit. I thought that was a really, really good thing. But when I wrote about globalization, even in The World is Flat, I always said there are upsides and there are downsides. The trick is to cushion the downsides and to get the best out of the upsides. People tended to ignore, some of the cautionary points I made. But I still believe in both. And to pick up on the film, and what I really focused on in my last book, Thank You for Being Late, it's that the faster the world gets, Shoma, the faster and more intertwined it gets. The more everything old and slow matters more than ever. Good parenting, good teaching, strong community, healthy values. The faster chips get, to put it in an American context, the more Sunday school you need, okay? The more religious strong values you need to ground you, because, and the most important value is the golden rule. And every faith and cultural tradition has some version of it. It matters more than ever today. Do unto others as you wish them to do unto you, because more people today can do unto others farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. And more others can do unto you farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. And so because of that, I've always, been grounded in those values and advocated them. I've said many times, I've actually never looked at Twitter. I've never looked at Facebook, and I've never smoked a cigarette. And my plan is to die saying all three. And because
Tom, I have to call you out on that.
Please.
You are on Twitter.
I
that
use
sounds
Twitter.
like three lies.
Yeah,
Now.
I use Twitter as a broadcast platform, but I don't consume any of it. And my assistant has my password. If my life depended on it, I wouldn't know how to get there. Okay, so I use it as a broadcast platform. But because I don't consume any social media, I joke with people. In my world, Shoma, everybody likes me. Okay, and what I mean by that, I didn't come on stage today after reading a bunch of tweets about me with my fists clenched and saying, Shoma, did you read what that person said? That's so unfair. So I find social media is just this giant energy suck that sucks people's energy away from creativity and collaboration. So that's what I'm about.
Right. But Tom, as I said, there was an exhilaration at one point, because in the beginning, it's like Moore's law, that in the beginning, it's slow, it looks healthy, and it's growing at a pace. Just in the Indian context, we have 800 million people online. It's definitely democratized access to knowledge. In the beginning, it looked like it was democratizing voices. And then Moore's law kicks in, and the second phase kicks in when it's so exponential that you can't control it, and it's like speeding away from you, So you've been talking about that we've now entered a world where it is becoming destructive. You've talked about the Ukraine war or the Gaza Israel war as the World War wired.
Yes.
So can you talk about that? What do you exactly mean by that? Why were you saying that these were the first world wars after the last world wars?
Yeah, I really started thinking about this, Shoma, after the Ukraine war began, and I wrote a column calling it World War I. That what we called World War I, that thing from 1914 to 1918, actually wasn't a world war. Half the world was colonized, including this country. Half the world were probably subsistence farmers. They didn't really participate. Ukraine is the first war where in the first 2 weeks, Argentinian and Indian farmers were short of fertilizer, and their diesel prices went up so much they were touched by the war, and therefore food costs went up from Charleston to Chad, basically. Number one. Number two, because over 3/4 of the world now has a smartphone, everyone could watch this war and opine on this war. So for instance, in America, within the first month of the war, Americans started going on Airbnb and renting rooms in Kiev and paying for them, knowing they weren't going to use them, just to send foreign aid to Ukrainians. So in about 2 weeks, Americans sent $20 million through the Airbnb platform as individuals. That was $20 million more than USAID had sent before it had even laced up its shoes. So we could opine about it, we could participate, we were affected by it. And that's why I called it the true First World War. And Gaza to me is World War II. It's the Second World War in many of the same respects.
Yeah, you also spoke about, I'd like to share with the audience that you said within the first few hours of the Ukraine war, many companies had to exit Russia, not because it was a government diktat, but because their employees or just social opinion had made it impossible for them to function in Russia. So it was literally like canceling out a nation, rather than even distinguishing between Russians and President Putin, It was all black-brushed into the one and same thing.
You really see, again, the flattening of hierarchies and how you now have not just stakeholder capitalism, but you have stakeholder empowerment. So the example I gave is that in the first month or so of the Ukraine war, roughly 1,000 American Western companies exited Russia. Not a single one was ordered to leave. They were all ordered to leave by their employees.
Yeah.
It was through Slack and Facebook. People just said, we're out of here. And I made that point actually to Israelis when it started, when the Gaza war started, that this same phenomena can happen. There's so many more people now can participate in these decisions.
Yeah, but you've been talking about simultaneous tipping points, and
Yeah.
as you said, you've been looking at this dynamic between nature, humans, and technology. So what are these other Pandora's boxes? And I'm going to come back to technology,
Sure.
but let's open some of the others. You've been writing a lot about Mother Nature.
Yeah.
So, and tell us the intersection between technology, Mother Nature, and its impacts on human beings and societies.
Well, let me start at sort of 30,000 feet, because this goes to the next book I'm working on. I'm working on a book on how to write a column, actually. Since we live in
How to write a column.
Since we live in a world where everyone wants to be a columnist, I mean, on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or wherever, I thought I'd write about how
all these platforms that you know nothing about.
Exactly, that I don't consume, but I do exploit. So I thought I'd write about my experience in writing a column. That's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is, what's the biggest thing I saw in my 45 years of doing this? What's the best thing I saw? What's the worst thing I saw? And what's the most hopeful thing I saw? So let me quickly try to go through these, because it will frame everything I'm going to say afterwards. The biggest thing I think I saw is that I was here, you were here, we were here for what I call a Promethean moment. So Prometheus, the mythic Greek deity who steals fire from a closet on Mount Olympus, gives it to humans to build civilization. And we know what these Promethean moments are. They're the printing press, the scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and this moment we're living through. We are here, Shoma, I think, and I don't think this is just presentism, for something really, really big. We're here for a Promethean moment. And the Promethean moments, what distinguishes them is that you have the introduction of a new set of technologies or ideas that don't just require you to change one thing, they require you to change everything. How we govern, how we educate, how we learn, how we do business, how we fight wars, how we commit crimes. And they're all radically changing right now. So what's driving our Promethean moment? What's unique about ours from the previous ones is that it isn't driven by a single technology like a printing press. It's actually driven by two what I call super cycles. And when I say that we're a Promethean moment, let's go back to the printing press just for a second. When the printing press was invented, I have a feeling that some monk said to some priest, "Now that is really cool." You mean I don't have to write this Bible out longhand anymore? I mean, we can just stamp them out. That's the kind of moment we're at. So ours is unique in that it isn't based on a single technology, though. It's based on what I call a technology supercycle. It's our ability to sense, digitize, connect, process, learn, now amplified by AI, share, and act. And we're putting that supercycle into everything, from your watch to your toaster to your fighter plane, okay? And it improves exponentially, because as each part improves, the whole improves at a nonlinear rate. What's unique also about our Promethean moment is that it's accompanied by a climate supercycle. Emissions, warming, ice melt, change in ocean currents, change in extreme weather. So the two are going around, each one in a nonlinear way. And what they did was blow apart the governing mechanism of the Industrial Revolution. What was that? It was the welfare state, basically. And the welfare state was a set of walls, ceilings, and floors. And our politics, left-right politics, was a debate about how high the walls should be, protection and no protection. Left said high walls, right said low walls. How thick the floor, the safety net should be. Left said thick floor, right said thin floor. And how tight the ceiling should be. The ceiling was on the pace of change. Left said linear, right said nonlinear. And on incomes, left said low ceiling, right said no ceiling. Same left-right debate, 75 years, then suddenly we wake up in the last 10 years, and every political party, basically in the industrial world, has blown up or is blowing up. Tories become a Brexit party, Republicans become a Trump cult. You can go right through the whole thing. And that's, I argue, because this new energy source came along, blew off the ceiling, blew down the walls, and crashed through the floor. And what it did was change a whole set of core relationships. The first is between humans and machines. We develop machines that have greater cognitive power than anything we evolved with. Change the relations between humans and nature. We are the first species to ever drive itself from one climate era, the Holocene, into another climate era, the Anthropocene. Change the relationship between humans and states. We now have superpowers, and we now have super empowered individuals who have the power equal to, and in some cases greater than, nation states, and change the relationship between states and states. Because what we've done is we've connected the whole world, We then greased the connections between the nodes, and then we took out the buffers. So now instability in one node gets transmitted to the whole system. So these are fundamental changes. And my argument is that we're going through, in effect, two climate changes in once. One in the change of the climate, and one in the change of the climate of technology. And when you think about, I'll just stop it here, how to govern that kind of world, I think you have to look to nature. Which ecosystems in nature thrive when the climate changes? It's those that build complex adaptive networks where all the elements of the ecosystem network together to maximize their resilience, productivity, and adaptability. I think the same, but now nature does it emergently and violently. The ibex eats the grass, the lion eats the ibex. What nature does emergently and violently, we need to do intentionally by building what I call complex adaptive coalitions, where all the elements of the coalition network together to maximize their adaptability, resilience, and productivity. Yep. So that's the biggest thing I saw.
So I'm going to come back to, you had several others, and we'll come to that. I just wanted to deepen this a little bit.
Please.
We've been talking about this exponential technology that's taking over us, and you've just described its impacts. And people who are coding generative AI, and I'm only looking at this one thing, which is generative AI that hit the world 1 year ago, and it's completely blown up the ceiling. You know? But the makers of generative AI themselves, from Brad Smith to Sam Altman himself to Mustafa Suleyman, the DeepMind, Jeff Dean, Jeffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, you name any of them, they themselves wrote a moratorium letter, saying, we have created a technology we're afraid of, we don't know how to control, and somebody stop us, And they were literally asking for regulation. But at the same time, the lab race has actually continued at a breakneck speed, And when you were saying that it's completely blown up the idea of the old structures, post-war structures, just one data point I would love you to reflect on is that just Microsoft, I'm not talking about the big tech four, just Microsoft's market cap is more than India's market cap, and we are the 5th largest economy in the world. We have 1.3 or 4 billion people. Just one company is, more wealthy or has more value than an entire nation. So what do you think about that level of concentration of knowledge, power, and wealth, Tom? And this looks as if it's a phenomenon outside of us. But actually, there's a very small group of people that's controlling the nature of what is being put out in the world. So, and you kind of meet all of them. You meet presidents, you meet corporate chieftains. Is there any thinking about this at a structural level? This is not outside of us.
Yeah, my primary thinking is that we need to not make the mistake that was made with social networks, which was to listen to Mark Zuckerberg and move fast and break things. We moved fast and we broke things, and one of the things we may have broken is partly societies by the way we destroyed truth and trust, or let social networks do that in a way that wasn't governed in the way the New York Times is governed, for instance. So we need to be very intentional about it. The question really is how. And I want to go back to complex adaptive coalitions. So, because I think this is a model for how we're going to have to govern these things. So what happens when you get this kind of super cycle is you get a bunch of phenomena at once. The world gets really fast. That's the pace of change. The world gets really fused. We're not interconnected now. We're interdependent in a totally different way. We are going to rise together or we're going to fall together, Shoma, for climate and technology reasons. But whatever we're going to do, baby, we're doing it together, okay? The world's gotten fast, fused. It's gotten deep. So deep, notice there's no global lexicographer, but we suddenly added the adjective deep to everything. Deep state, deep mind, deep research, deep medicine. Why is that? Because we intuited that technology was going to a place where we couldn't see it anymore. It was going into the deep. The song from Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga from their movie is called Shallow. But listen to the words. It's the anthem of our time. I'm off the deep end, watch as I dive in. I'll never reach the shore. Crash through the surface where they can't hurt us. We're far from the shallow now.
You needed to sing that, Tom.
We are far from the shallow now, okay? So technology
Tom, wait. You haven't earned your claps unless you sing that. You sang something for me before. You've got to sing this one.
I can't do Bradley Cooper, let alone Lady Gaga. So we are so far from the shallow now that, again, the old left-right thing breaks down. What was that? In the old left-right system, I Indian business innovate? You, Indian government, regulate. But what if you, Indian government, have no clue where I am? Then you're American Senator Orrin Hatch questioning Mark Zuckerberg and saying to Mr. Zuckerberg, if you give your product away for free, how do you make money? So the regulator has no clue where the innovator is. So this brings us back to complex adaptive coalitions. I'll give you an example of exactly what I mean. Well, I think we'll have to apply to AI. So I'm in Israel in 2019 before COVID, and I ran into Amnon Shashua, who runs Mobileye, the Israeli autonomous driving company that Intel bought for $14 billion. And he said to me, Tom, have you ever driven in a self-driving car? I said, Amnon, I was just at Google. I rode in Waymo all over Mountain View. He said, Mountain View. That's a grid. Try driving in a self-driving car in Jerusalem where there are no two parallel streets. So I went up to Jerusalem, drove in their car, up, down, around, donkeys, camels, Jews, Arabs. Nobody's driving. And I was blown away. And he told me afterwards something interesting. To test a self-driving car in Israel, you need an insurance protocol that determines what constitutes safe self-driving. Otherwise, anyone you hit, you'd get sued. Well, it turns out an insurance protocol for autonomous driving was a little deep for the rabbis who run Jerusalem, okay? So Amnon had to convene a complex adaptive coalition of Volkswagen, their car supplier, Mobileye engineers, the rabbis who run Jerusalem, and the Israeli Ministry of Transportation, and they collaboratively wrote the law together. It's so good that Yandex, Russia's Google, tests their self-driving cars in Israel, and China just took the whole Israeli law, translated into Chinese, and made it their law. Who is left and who is right in that story? There's no left and right. There's a whole new problem that requires a complex adaptive coalition. It requires the engineering talent, the ethical input of the government. We have to govern in a completely different way.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought this up, Tom, because I'm hoping with the entire array of speakers we have here that everyone does look at technology or indeed any phenomenon like this in a very unidimensional way, you know,
Yeah.
and I think what you're constantly emphasizing is this intersection, that it cannot function alone and in itself, you know.
Can I just take two seconds to talk in a minute each for what's the best thing I saw, I think, in my life, and what's the worst thing I saw? So the best thing I think happened in my 40 years was the creation of the European Union. Now, Americans, Shoma, will do anything for the EU except read about it, okay? They are not the least bit interested in the EU. But when you stop and think about it, a continent known from time immemorial for tribal, sectarian, and religious wars created the biggest market and center for free markets, free people, the rule of law, and human rights in my lifetime. A second United States of America, a second United States of India was born in our lifetime. And the world we live in is so much better for that, and it is the mother of modern complex adaptive coalitions. What's the worst thing I saw? So let's go now to the nature side of it. So the worst thing that happened in my life, I believe, is that, you know, one of the things I do, the way I learned, is I study nature a lot, use a lot of analogies from that. So on my first environmental trip with Conservation International, I went to the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil 25 years ago, and I learned about mangroves. Mangroves, they're these wonderful forests that grow in saltwater in coastal regions. I didn't know anything about mangroves. Turns out mangroves do 4 amazing things in nature. They filter toxins and pollutants. They create nurseries for young fish to grow because they have cabled roots so big fish predators can't get in. They anchor the shoreline, and they buffer storms. So the towns in Aceh, Indonesia that took out their mangroves got washed away. Right. Those that kept them preserved them. And the worst thing that happened in my life, Shoma, is we lost our mangroves, but not just in nature. You see, shame was a mangrove. It used to be if you were running for president of the United States and you had unprotected sex with a stripper 5 weeks after your wife gave birth to your son, you were out of politics. We lost shame as a mangrove. Elite responsibility was a mangrove, okay? Church, synagogue, temple, mosque were mangroves. Local newspapers were mangroves. We've lost all these filters and buffers. Now here is the good news. You can, and this is the best thing I saw, you can rebuild a mangrove. But you have to be extremely, in nature, you got to be extremely intentional about it. And ditto in politics. And the example I give, and this is how the book concludes, is every year the Washington Post does, they have a series on sort of good news. We need that now, separate section, just good news, okay? So 2019, Christmas, they do a story about a town between Baltimore and Washington called Rogers Forge. Excuse me, it's 2021. And a man knew that his neighbor across the street was depressed because of COVID. She had recently lost her husband. So at Christmas time, on the spur of the moment, without asking or telling anyone, he was stringing his Christmas lights, as we do, and he decided to string his Christmas lights up his house, across the telephone pole, and light up her house without telling her. And then called her and said, look outside. He left a tin of cookies on her doorstep. And she was deeply moved by it. Well, other people in the town saw what he did, and they went to Best Buy, they cleaned out Best Buy, and everyone in the town hung their Christmas lights horizontally. And the Post ran this amazing picture of Main Street Rogers Forge, where someone had put "Love Lives Here," and the whole thing is lit up crisscross by Christmas lights. And I said to myself, when I saw that picture, what does that look like? It looks like a mangrove. That is a human mangrove, okay? So whatever you do, if you take nothing from this talk, please hang your Diwali lights horizontally this year, okay?
It's a really powerful metaphor, Tom. You know, it's kind of that eureka moment in my head.
Yeah.
There are two things, you know, before we run out of
Please.
time. Is that, like I said earlier, you know, you do have the privilege of sitting with people in extreme positions of power, both politically and, you know, in the innovator circuit. Is any of this thinking permeating those circles, Tom? You know, particularly Silicon Valley. You know, this sort of image we have of the conference is this robot with two little boys. And it became our mascot because I think it's a metaphor for how decisions being made thousands of miles away actually jumps geographies, borders, stratas, social cultures, and impacts even the most vulnerable, you know, in the human chain. And yet there's intimacy, there's optimism, but there's intentionality, you know. And I think there's definitely a kind of blindness about the impacts that a lot of these technologies will have across the world. So one quick, and then I want to come to geopolitics and the Middle East.
Just very quickly, you know, I talk the talk of technology and globalization, but I actually don't walk the walk personally. You know what I mean? I'm interested in them. I want to get the best out of them always and cushion the worst. And just one of my core rules of life is there is no such thing as a virtual community. There's only a real community, okay? I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe in robot friends. I don't believe in, you know, robocalls to help you. There's only real community built on truth and trust. And those are the pillars of any democracy. Without truth, we don't know which way to go. And without trust, we can't go there together. And no big, hard thing can be done except together. And so anything that's building that is a good thing for me. But to think that there's technological substitutes for what we're doing right now, Shoma, I just don't believe that. I'm very old-fashioned about that.
But sadly, Tom, you know, as we go further and deeper into these 2 days, I think that's going to be an obsolete conversation. You know, if we really need to look at the future, we need to talk about technological mangroves. You know, we need people to plant technological mangroves because right now what we are planting is a technological jungle, you know, with all the savagery of jungle laws. And, you know, we'll have wonderful minds talking about that. I just want to come back to your absolute forte, Tom, and it kind of interconnects with all of this, is the Middle East. You know, when you said this has blown up geopolitics, we've also had asymmetrical power now. You know, 3D printed bombs in Ukraine can take on the might of Russia. You know, tunnels under the ground with Hamas, you know, besieged from all sides can, you know, take Israel's technological infrastructure by surprise. So there's that aspect of, you know, the asymmetry where somebody else was saying that just this mobile phone is more powerful than a tank today. You know, it packs that much power. 17 trillion calculations in a second. You know, that's what it's capable of. But you've been writing about a new axis, Tom, which is the inclusion network versus the resistance network. I wanted you to share that very quickly with the audience, but I also have a critique of it, and I want to press your points on that. You know?
So, I start, Shoma, by asking what was going on in the world on October 6th, before the Hamas invasion, the day before. And I would argue the big thing going on in the world on October 6th was that Ukraine was trying to join the West, and Israel was trying to join the East. So Ukraine was trying to join the European Union. Israel was in the process of negotiations with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations, and was all revolving on what terms Israel would grant to the Palestinians towards statehood. But that was what was going on. I believe what happened on October 7th was that, I mean, what's happened with the Ukraine war and October 7th is Russia stopped the first, and Hamas and Iran stopped the second. Now, what the great transformation that's happened in the Middle East, in the time I've covered it, is that we now have two kinds of leaders in the region. You have, in most of my time covering the Middle East, leaders there built their legitimacy by resistance. Follow me, because I'm resisting the Shia, the Jews, the Americans, Israel, whoever. Follow me, my legitimacy is based on resistance. We now have a whole new generation of Arab leaders who are saying, I want to build my legitimacy on resilience. Follow me because I'm creating educational resilience, gender resilience, environmental resilience. So that's the struggle right now in the region. Now, you know, to me, and so you have now what I call this inclusion network. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, wants to link up with Israel. They actually want to create a EU in the Middle East, all right? Versus this resistance network of Russia, Iran, Hamas, basically who don't believe in that inclusion at all. They believe in winner take all. Neither side, though, is all of one or the other. So, you know, Israel has its own resistance network inside of it, as do the Gulfies. But that is the big clash today, I believe, in the region and in the world.
So two things there, Tom, that, you know, this, when we were chatting earlier, I said, you've always been a very astute diviner of technology, nature, you know, these interconnections. But even earlier when Russia invaded Ukraine, you and I had a conversation where I said, what's also being shown up is American exceptionalism, you know? And it's intriguing, and last time you said that it gave you a moment of pause when you were saying everyone's captured in their own information bubbles and their confirmation biases. And I'd said that in a way, so is America, and so is even you know, who's a very, very veteran political watcher. Because, you know, you were talking about this sort of default sense that there's an axis of good and there's an axis of evil. And we've seen how America's positioning of others as axis of evil has, you know, unleashed terrible, terrible tragedies upon the world. You know, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, you know, your alliance with Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is opening up now, but it's been an extremely, you know, to use your words, a resistance network. But America stood by it, you know. So I was, the only part of your recent commentary and interpretation of the world, which was worrying, is that you're again creating a binary axis, you know, which goes against everything else that you're saying. And in that, for instance, you said, you know, just in this last bit of flare up in the Middle East, you said Saudi Arabia was, through the Abraham Accords, making friends with Israel, and the Houthis have stopped it. And you said, here's a band of people that one has never really heard of, who suddenly can hold up global trade worth 14% of global trade in the Red Sea. But that struck me, Tom, that maybe that's the heart of the problem, that someone like you could say, I've never heard of the Houthis, which there's been a terrible...
I had heard of them, believe me.
But you meant the world.
You meant the world. Generally,
where there's been civil war and terrible civilian, you know, for more than 10, 15 years. And it's not part of the global conversation at all. And America's not really concerned about that and is aligning with Saudi Arabia. And yet there's this very clean binaries that are created. You know? Yes, Iran and Russia are pretty sort of autocratic for their own communities. But there are many communities within Iran and Russia that possibly are in resistance to their own governments. But we're creating these axes of good and evil, you know? And similarly, there's a blindness about wiping out 35,000 civilians in Gaza. So I'd like you to comment on that now.
Yeah, look, there's always a tension in these things, Shoma, that we could talk about the Houthis. I mean, I know a lot about that civil war. I mean, this was a single tribe that came out of the north that imposed itself on the whole country. I mean, these are not, you know, Boys and Girl Scouts. They did not have an inclusive vision at all. What everyone thinks about Ukraine, I happen to believe that the Ukrainian people have a right to self-determination, as much as I do for Indians or Palestinians, and that you can't just claim a sphere of influence if you're Putin. Spheres of influence in today's world have to be earned. If you want me in your sphere of influence, then you've got to earn it. And I, as a Ukrainian, the majority of them were saying. I want to be in the European sphere of influence because I think I can realize my full potential there much more than in Putin's sphere of influence. And so I find there's, you could accuse me of moral relativism. You know, I'm not paying attention enough to these others. I could accuse you of the same thing. That it's very convenient to say, well, we got to understand Putin's point of view. He is, you know, after all, a big power. He's selling cheap oil, you know, to some people who enjoy cheap oil. And so I just think that cuts both ways, okay? And I'm quite comfortable on Ukraine, for instance. Look, also, never take a snapshot of me through a column. I was the single biggest, loudest opponent of NATO expansion, okay, back in 1989, for exactly the reason, saying, wait a minute, Putin has a point of view, Russia has a point of view. And so these are all evolutionary. If you just take a snapshot of one column and say, well, you know, you're not sensitive to Putin, I could take the same snapshot of India or other developing countries and saying you're being incredibly cynical, siding with this guy just because we are inconsistent in what we do. But to your point, and we need to be sensitive to this, we are inconsistent. We follow and are in touch with people who are more like us, people who are more connected to us, and we're completely indifferent, often, to suffering in different places, Yemen, Syria, or elsewhere. And so all I would say is we both have work to do.
No, and absolutely, Tom. I was not taking a snapshot of your column.
It's okay.
I was trying to open a window into, you know, like you were saying, the whole geopolitical structures are breaking down.
Sure.
Because the UN and, you know, the International Court of Justice, structures that one thought would have a kind of moral high ground, you know, nobody's listening to them.
Yeah.
So whether it's America, you know, even resisting the ceasefire, or UN is going on saying things that this is a huge humanitarian disaster. So what I was leading up to is that when you're talking about this new mangroves, that is it actually a new intellectual challenge for how geopolitics and geopolitical frameworks need to express itself? So it was my harsh entry into a soft conversation.
Harsh entry into giving me a soft landing.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. This is what I come for this. It's, yeah, you know, one of the things I say about Gaza, for instance, Shoma, is that, and it's even true of Ukraine, I never describe the problem. My entire focus is on describing the solution. I could never describe the sort of moral, complex, you know, interaction between Israelis and Palestinians in a way that would satisfy both sides. I say 47, they say 46. I say 46, they say 29. You can never describe the problem, and you can really get caught up doing that, whether it's Ukraine or this. And so if you look at all my columns on this, I'm entirely focused 90% of the time on describing the solution. How do we get out of this in a way that is morally, ethically, strategically right for both sides? And that's why I've had a simple motto on Israel-Palestine, and it's never changed. I'm for a two-state solution. 2 states for 2 nations. And if you're for a 2-state solution, you're my friend. If you're not for a 2-state solution, you're not my friend. And I don't care whether you're a Jew or Arab or Christian or Hindu or Muslim, it does not matter. Because unless we can find a way out of this, this is going to go on and on and on. Only here's the problem, Shoma, and you touched on it in your question. With that empowerment, smaller and smaller units now can create bigger and bigger damage, farther and farther, faster and faster, cheaper and cheaper. And so what I've been saying to Israelis is basically, you can either have a new relationship with Palestinians in 2025, or you can have a war with Palestinians over 1947 with new weapons. But 2024 is no longer available. So this is really, either we're going to go back to the most primal shepherd's war of Israelis and Palestinians, only with drones and the most advanced weapons, precision rockets, or we're going to a new relationship. And that's why, you know, I look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For me, I always say it is to wider trends in civilization what off-Broadway is to Broadway. Okay, stuff starts there in miniature and comes to Broadway. And I think what's starting there in miniature, I was just at CENTCOM, our Middle East Command, 2 weeks ago, and I asked the commanders there, what happens if Hezbollah and Israel go to war? Because Hezbollah has precision rockets. That means you fire one, it hits the target. Not Hamas, you fire 50 and one lands. And he said, I'm going to give you an answer that comes from your first book. Everything will be on fire from Beirut to Jerusalem. Israelis and Palestinians cannot afford the next war. Neither can Indians or Pakistanis. Neither can any of these traditional conflicts as we go into precision weapons for individuals. None of us can afford the next war. The next war for everybody is a nuclear war. It leads to total destruction. And if there's one lesson we take from this war, it should be that. And that's why you may recall when this war started, I advised the Israelis to look at what Manmohan Singh did in 2008 after the Taj Hotel terrorist attack. He never retaliated.
Yeah.
You know.
Thank you very much, Tom. You know, that's just opening doors of very, very deep conversations that we hope we'll keep having. You know, this is just the start. It's a thought seeder. And thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I think you've left us with a really powerful idea, the idea of a mangrove, you know, intentional mangroves that we have to plant in every sphere of our lives, even technological ones and geopolitical ones.
Yeah.
And you play a big role in mediating and interpreting the world for us, Tom.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very
Really
much
appreciate
for
it.
being
Thank
here.
you. Thanks so much.